Hello and welcome to our three-part discussion on artificial intelligence and technology, where we will explore some of the issues that will affect and probably transform the way we think about the role of the individual executive, the impact on companies, and how society itself is likely to change. I'm Paul Lewis, the editorial director of Headspring, and to discuss these big issues, I'm joined by Mark Esposito, a leading thinker, writer, and teacher on artificial intelligence and technology, and whom I'm very proud to say is one of Headspring's faculty members. Welcome, Mark. Obviously, the way a company operates is undergoing huge change. But when one imposes the artificial intelligence and technical developments, which are also changing rapidly, what areas do you think are going to transform the way we expect companies to operate? And I'm thinking in terms of the way decisions are made, the way strategy is set, the way companies have an obligation to their own employees, and wider society, which are big issues now, but I can see a complete reshaping of that agenda. Perhaps you can give us a sense, perhaps start with the question of how decisions are made and who ultimately has responsible for decisions.
Sure, thanks for having me, Paul. And, I have to say the transformation has happened in the last 2-3 years to the pace we have never imagined before. I'm going to give you an example. So in my very last World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, it was January 2020, before, so like COVID became our headline. The founder of the forum announced in the opening that it was the shareholder capitalism was dead. We were now moving into a stakeholder capitalism. But back in the days, we hardly really knew what it means. And later on, in a different conversation with a leading thinker called Henry Mintzberg, he said, we're talking about the pluralistic society, a society in which multiple people, multiple players have a significant role. And I think this is where most likely a combination of where the technology is going, the trends, and the decision-making will take us into the future. I think today, there are multiple factors. Consumers are much more influential in decision-making than we can see before, because they are the one that shift markets elsewhere. We saw this during the pandemic, that suddenly consumer preferences were moving and companies were moving alongside. So there is clearly a feedback mechanism that needs to be integrated with that. There is, of course, the idea that measuring value and defining what we do in the organization does not stay inside the organization only. There is an inside-out relationship that matters. There is an outside-in relationship that matters. There's equally an inside-inside internal stakeholder, and there's an outside-outside happening no matter what we think. So by expanding the dimension to different form of cardinal points, I think we really have expanded the stakeholder universe to more people involved in the decision-making. But fundamentally, if I have to narrow down your question to something, I think that the rise of non-financial performance indicators and what we capture into, at first SDG, but more precisely into ESG, the environmental, societal, and governance indicators, is really where companies are now seeing their next few trajectories. We used to think that decision-making had to be fundamentally primed by financial decisions. Today, we understand that the financial decision does not necessarily suffice for that kind of conversation. So I see an enlargement of the decision-making board from financial, non-financial determinants. They are allowing more and more people to say the purpose of an organization is more than just maximizing revenue. And I think this is a positive movement that I see. And clearly, I'll talk more about ESG and the relationship with technology, but I would have never imagined this acceleration where large amount of investment now going to or towards companies. They are performing very well from a non-financial metrics. This is, for me, fresh, is new, and I think is welcome.
It's certainly the big issue of the day, and probably will be, depending on sort of the speeds of global warming and the urgency that people feel is upon us. If we move on to the actual sort of technicalities of making decisions,
Mhm.
and the idea that some decisions maybe in the past were made on gut instinct, maybe some data, but there's clearly been a hierarchy. The buck stops with the CEO, and we understand where the responsibility lies. But if you're talking about things where, I mean, there are many fields, and from the sort of healthcare, justice system, as well as business, where we think a computer algorithm would probably come up generally with a better result, but we may not quite know how it came up with those results. And then the question is, do we just go with the result and trust it, or do we sort of revert back to an individual at the top who has to take responsibility for it? I asked that question simply. I was watching the World Chess Championships, and with Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomuk, and it was fascinating, the commentary, because they would always refer to what the computer thought.
Yeah,
they didn't understand whether the move was good or not, or why it was good, but they said, well, the computer says, it's a 6 out of 10 or whatever, without understanding. That's a sport, and we want to see human versus human, but in business and in other aspects of life, we don't necessarily. We just want the best result.
Yeah.
So who ultimately is going to take responsibility? Do we say the computer said this, the computer said this person is guilty or innocent, and they have a better record than humans, and we're not really going to ask many more questions than that?
Yeah. Paul, I'll answer straight with the answer. The answer is human in the loop. That's the answer. What does it mean? Computers are phenomenal in building statistical models. They're much more accurate than if I resort back to my memory or to my expertise, simply because we're dealing with a data-driven strategy, which is much more precise than my own ability to remember, to know. That said, as you rightly said, the explainability of algorithm is what we call the black box. We can't really know how the algorithm ends up with one decision. So we should never let the algorithm become deterministic to the point in which we can't explain why. Because even if I make a decision and I am wrong, within my being human, that is perfectly fine. But imagine delegating that level of responsibility to algorithm. I mean, it will be the end of society as we see this. So I think, sometimes we are urged into this relationship between what is the nexus between humans and machines. And very often we have this idea that the efficiency is always in favor of machines. Of course, if you ask the question about who's more efficient between an algorithm and humans, the answer is algorithm. But is the essence of life efficiency? It's much more than that. So I think by expanding the conversation to say, well, what happens if I'm integrating the technology into the job of a person? Well, that's probably is the third space that we like to integrate. That's what we call in our work with my colleagues and my research, symbiointelligence. Is the idea of integrating technology into existing jobs. And I have an example, Paul, that I think will be clarifying for everyone. So one of the most renowned medical algorithm is what is called IBM Watson. It's considered to be the most sophisticated doctor on earth. So to the question, who is more likely to predict cancer? A doctor tapping on her or his clinical experience, or IBM Watson? Well, the answer is IBM Watson. And you can come up with the coefficient and ratio, and you can determine that the algorithm is more efficient than the doctor. Fine. But the question is to go to the next level. What happens when the doctor uses IBM Watson? And the answer is the ratio prediction is much higher. So integrating, that's what the symbiote is all about. Technology into our job fundamentally improves our jobs. And if this scares some of our listeners or viewers, back in the 60s, when we introduced ATMs, there were people in the bank freaked out that maybe they would lose their job. But now that I was automating a process that doesn't have to be done directly by a person in the bank, banking employees were able to expand and do something else. They were able to take the banking industry to the next level. We became personal banker, we became portfolio analysts, so we expanded. So I think the decision-making should be always in the hands of humans, but technology can definitely become the most significant form of statistical modeling for us to have more accurate information. Let's use a sentence that is easy to remember. The golden mile should always be determined by humans. even if it's the last mile before you get home, but that should always be a decision that we make as humans. Otherwise, we will get to a level of ambivalence / equivalence with machines that I don't think is healthy, Paul.
No, I can see all sorts of problems there. But so I guess, yeah, so if I understand it, you're saying that so long as the doctor or the CEO understands that how that decision got made, even if he or she couldn't possibly get it themselves, but they understand it, then we're basically still on safe territory.
Yeah.
But what happens? But what
yeah.
happens if they don't understand it, or maybe they don't agree with it?
Yeah.
And they say, well, I don't agree with it, but there's this other authority which says, well, we have a better record of selecting employees, hiring, training, firing. So, you know, maybe we shouldn't go with the CEO on this one.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. I think there's a two reflection on what you say. The first one is that, you know, back in the days, the CEO would think of a technology problem by saying, go and see IT. And IT was usually in the -1 or in the basement, right? They were never working together. And IT was very far from the strategy of the CEOs or the C-suites. So I think we have a design of the organization that needs to take into account that today technology is no longer just a department, is a core element of any business. Nadella from Microsoft said in a quite famous quote, every single job is a digital component. Look at us right now. We're having an interview, but we're using a platform for that to happen, right? And it doesn't change who we are. It simply enhances it, right? Because we don't have to be in the same location, but we can still be in the same location virtually. So I think the question is always about integrating functions so that we understand more of each other. That will be the first part. The second answer is, algorithms equally come from coding that happen to be human generated. So there are biases. So no specific outcome is actually perfect, but it's more accurate. The ability for, I would say, an executive branch to make decision based on what the algorithm says or not, it's a leadership skill. And I think we should not necessarily use technology as a way of discount or to discard leadership. We should use technology to empower leadership, which means it's still a decision you're taking and there is accountability. It's just the sourcing is different. So you might have a CEO that disagrees. As far as there's accountability on those actions, I think that's fine. But I believe that if the CEO or whoever was more inclined in understanding how the technology works, likely we will create more collaborative areas between the two different, let's say, conflicting sides. And I'm going to give you an example from my own experience, Paul. So in my career, I co-founded a company that is an AI company. And I remember this challenge between the engineers who are doing the coding and the business people. The engineers said, if we can get to 99% accuracy, we should. And the commercial people said, I don't need 99, I need 85, it's good enough. Why? Numbers mean something different depending on where we are. So the relative allocation of value to numbers happens only if you can work together, in which you understand that there is no absolute about 99 versus 85. It's just depending on what you're currently doing. So relativizing technology to what we need as society, organizations, decision-making, leadership, I think is a much better skill to eventually foster than becoming overly dependent on a technology that we can't easily understand. I would say that where I would strike a balance.
I guess there are some areas of decision-making that lend themselves to an algorithm, and maybe recruitment, for example, might be one. Early stage recruitment might be one. I'm wondering whether or not strategy, the decision on strategy, if we go look ahead maybe 10, 15 years ahead, where so much data will be integrated and analyzed, whether or not something as sort of amorphous as setting strategy could still be done by algorithm or some sort of machine learning, or whether that's really a human endeavor.
Yeah, interesting point. Paul, there is currently something called DAO, right? Decentralized Autonomous Organization, where algorithm manage the entire process. Now, maybe some functions can be entirely managed And that means that equally determining what to do, which might be an active strategy by algorithm. I'm going to give an example. Fraud prevention on credit cards is much better with algorithm than if I had to have a person that is trying to check what's happening in a abuse of a card, right? Most of the efforts in credit card companies to become preventative of frauds is because algorithm can study behavior, they can pick up anomalies, they can immediately stop payments, they can trace it, right? We need technology for the level of sophistication, right? There will be other functions that will be perfectly fine for that. I'm thinking about whether we can help decarbonize our footprint in buildings, whether we can have organizations deciding to use DAOs, right, to basically manage their energy footprint. They don't need humans for that. But I see this to be functional delegated to technology in the same way that we're delegating to a calculator, something that we used to do 100 years ago on the board. So I don't see this making us, dehumanizing us. I see us simply giving us time for more important things for us to do.
This is very interesting, because there is this discussion about whether we're getting sort of softer and stupider because machines do the work for us. There's this huge debate about mobile phone usage and how much people continue to read. I don't know exactly what the data is on. My sense is that people read a lot less. Maybe I'm just talking about myself. So I'm just wondering whether or not, some of the functions obviously make things efficient, and we're happy to hand them over. But are we handing over too many skills? Are we saying that actually we can't quite think clearly on things because we know that an algorithm can do the work for us? Are we losing skills that we don't want to lose?
Yeah. Well, I think for sure we are. I mean, over-dependency on technology is as bad as under-dependency on technology. Extremes are not necessarily good. I'm worried when we use technology extensively for our children's education, because we know now that the brain is not a multitasker, is a serial processor. That learning to write on paper teaches skills that is not the same if you write it on the iPad. That reading on paper gives us a higher retention of content if I'm reading on my Kindle or my PDF files. So I clearly think neuroscience is teaching us what the brain can and cannot do. And there is a clear story that I don't want to say we're dumbing ourselves down a little bit, but I just said it, right? We sometimes are dumbing ourselves down because we are becoming over dependent. And think about, for example, driving. I mean, I old enough to remember learning how to drive without GPS. And I remember that I had to learn my way around, right? And today, if I'm in a city where I'm completely dependent on the GPS, I cannot necessarily do again what I did. I'm just following the GPS. It shows you a dependency that doesn't make me necessarily a better driver in that city. So I think understanding where you're going to actually draw a line in the sand, in where technology is enhancing, technology is actually inhibiting, I think is critical. Maybe education is a good way to start, but also in terms of social dynamics, there is some beauty in people being people and hanging out with each other and spending time in icebreaking. I found it difficult to replicate coffee breaks on Zooms, for example, or on Teams. It's not the same. Vibes is not the same. I think there's a clear indication that technology does what technology is designed to do, which is great, but it shouldn't become a substitute or a surrogate of life the way we actually, otherwise we truly are going to determine our life based on an algorithmic function. And we saw this already with the dating apps. They are not necessarily generating more meaningful relationships, they're generating more transactions. Because we're sort of like forgetting what meeting people is all about.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for these insights. I'd like to talk a bit more about the philosophical areas, which I think we can do on the next time. But for this understanding of what lies ahead for the company and its operations, I think this has been extremely valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.